We're hearing a lot about tariffs. Our next guest knows more about this than anyone we know. David?
Lori Wallach is a 30-year veteran of international U.S. congressional trade battles, starting with the 1990s fights over NAFTA and WTO, where she founded the Global Trade Watch Group at Public Citizen. She is now the director of the Rethink Trade program at American Economic Liberties Project, and is also senior advisor to the Citizens Trade Campaign, the U.S. National Trade Justice Coalition of Unions and Environmental, Consumer, Faith, Family Farm, and other groups. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Lori Wallach.
Thank you very much.
Welcome back, Lori. Well, tell us what the situation is now with Trump, tariffs, the zigzag Trumpsters on tariffs, and what's likely to be happening in terms of a trade war.
We now have such an enormous trade imbalance. We have lost so many million manufacturing jobs, and frankly, the national resilience and security that goes with being able to make key things. We have hollowed out so many communities in so many states that we literally have our life expectancy going down from deaths of despair, where there is a gap of 8 years in life expectancy based on whether or not you have a college degree. Because the majority of our country, who does not have a college degree, has had such a terrible path of lower wages, of the tax bases in their communities also collapsing, both when their taxes, but the companies, those 90 million factories that were offshored or killed by unfair imports, they're not paying taxes. That means that the local hospital closed and the schools closed and the fire department doesn't have a full staff and your whole quality of life is falling apart. And you know what those deaths of despair, that difference in life expectancy is based on? It's things like drug overdoses. It's cirrhosis and other alcohol-related disease. It is untreated diabetes and related side effects because people can't afford the medical care. Literally, a huge swath of our country has gotten viciously hurt by this model, and they are honkin' mad, and not wrongly so. And so what we've seen is both a swing towards whatever politician is talking their tune about how they got screwed by this trade agenda and that they're going to do something about it. We have seen the word tariff now take on its own positive emotive value in the way NAFTA is a dirty word. You could be a working class person who was not even born when NAFTA was destroying American manufacturing. Yet, NAFTA is a dirty word. You may not even know the details of what it is. It just means bad trade. Tariff has started to mean, and there's a bunch of social science research and opinion research showing this, standing up for me in my community, fighting for me, standing up against unfair trade. And so the deployment of tariffs has a political value separate from whether it's useful, which gets us to Trump. He talked a lot about tariffs. He won because of tariffs. He won the first time because we had the Democrats, the Democratic president, Obama, pushing for passage of that Pacific Rim NAFTA, the TPP, right through the fall of the election. And he basically, in picking up and getting a majority of working class voters, first time Republicans have had a clean majority of working class, non-college educated voters, basically taking what would have been the FDR coalition and moving that as Republican voting. That happened because he deployed, as a genius marketer, the idea of tariffs as the symbolic value of you've been screwed, I'm standing up for you, I'm going to fight back. And what did we get from the Democrats? We got the tone-deaf answer of tariffs are a tax on all of us, where most of the country was begging for someone to pull out a big honking tariff and hit some multinational corporation over the head and try and build back their community. So now we've got Trump in office with a lot of expectations for working class Americans, the Democrats in total disarray, no path forward for Democratic Party without winning back the working class. And the real question is, what's Trump actually going to do with his lack of discipline, lack of diagnosis? Is he even, were he so inclined, going to deploy the tariff tool in a way that actually delivers the necessary change? Footnote, to date, does not look so good. Or are we actually going to see some real change? I mean, the first Trump term was super helpful on the trade front because there was a guy who was the top trade guy named Robert Lighthizer, super smart guy, actually does care about working people, probably the only good person in the entire Trump administration. And the man was perfectly suited to break all the damn furniture in the neoliberal living room. And so he busted up a whole bunch of stuff. He actually showed you can deploy tariffs. And actually, the earth won't hurl into the sun, which is what we were basically told by all the economists. Oh, if you use that tool, that's the end of us all. So all of this was set up. Biden sort of built on it. He raised tariffs relative to what Trump had in place. He added the missing stuff, the other industrial policy tools you need to actually get the tariffs to translate into investment in new manufacturing jobs. And now here we are with Trump, and it's looking like a tariff roller coaster as compared to tariff strategy, where, the investors you need to invest in making a new factory. This roller coaster is such a, they're looking for the barf bags, not their checkbooks. I mean, this is not looking good.
Well, it's not looking good. And I want to just clarify something for our listeners here. These corporate managed trade agreements have done two things that are very bad for our country. First of all, they've managed to surrender our sovereignty to a rather secretive World Trade Organization in Geneva, Switzerland, which can actually enforce sanctions if we violate these corporate trade agreements. So one example that Laurie and I would tell members of Congress, Senator Harkin knew that child labor is illegal in this country. But we were importing products from South Asian nations that were using child labor. So he wanted to prohibit that. And he was told by the Office of Trade Representative, don't do that, Tom, because it violates the World Trade Organization agreement. And they can take you to the World Trade Organization tribunals in Geneva, and you'd lose. So we lost sovereignty over importing child labor exploited products into our own country. The second example is this. These corporations couldn't go to a state, say like Mississippi. What if Mississippi wanted to pay its workers $4 an hour? And these companies in New York and Illinois and California said, hey, we want to go there. Well, they couldn't because you had a federal safety net of a minimum wage and other minimal safety nets under the Fair Labor Trade Standards Act. So what did these companies do? They just went into a foreign Mississippi called China, starting out at $2 a day or $3 a day, and using this exploited labor with their Chinese corporate partners like Apple Computers, where they have nets on various levels of the factory because these famished and exploited workers would try to commit suicide by jumping out of the factory window. And they basically made a ton of money and then exported the products back to the United States. Textiles, furniture, pharmaceuticals, auto parts, you name it. iPhones. You see, Laurie, how pernicious this is from any standard of loyalty to our country, to our community, to our workers, which built these industries, and to the taxpayers who subsidize these American companies, and to the military that went overseas and defended these corporations from left-type governments that wanted to stand up. I just want to interject those to show how pernicious these U.S. corporations have been over the years and what they've gotten away with. What's the prognosis in the next few weeks or months with the Trumpsters?
So the next big moment is April 2nd, where they're going to announce something they're calling the reciprocal tariff plan. And we're going to see if they really are doing reciprocal tariffs, which would be a really bad idea. That is more free trade agreements. That is the myth you can export your way out of our trade deficit. It's the same story workers and farmers in this country have been told with each bad trade agreement, which is we have to get the other countries to cut their tariffs. That's what we have to do. Versus, are we going to see reciprocal trade? Because just as a footnote, reciprocal tariff is just an ignorant idea. And so it's the idea of we have to have the same tariff levels as everyone else. So, that would work out real well. So, hello, we export 2 billion in cars, vehicles, trucks to Japan every year. They send to us $54 billion in cars. Guess what? We are the people with the 25% tariff on trucks and the 2.5% tariff on cars. Japan is duty-free in all vehicles. Clearly, having reciprocal tariffs in that circumstance means we're going to be even more deeply screwed because now we're going to be flooded with tariffs, not just cars. So the idea of the one for one, nah, not the way to go. But will they try and do reciprocal trade? Reciprocal trade is a different thing. And it is not wrong. So I'm going to step back and say something that will probably blow the mind of the listener who loves Ralph Nader and is listening to his show, which is there are 3 totally legitimate, totally kosher uses of tariffs. Number 1, you use tariffs as incentives. So friends, if you are for the climate crisis being dealt with, you are probably for border carbon adjustments, CBAMs. That is a tariff. That is a tariff against products to equalize the cost of internalizing carbon emissions so that basically you create an incentive to internalize those costs to have low carbon production, and you don't ruin the companies that are doing the right thing. Are you for enforceable labor standards? You're for tariffs, stand by, because how you sanction countries that are cheating on stuff like suppressing wages by busting independent unions, you put up a tariff. Similarly, and there are all kinds of forms of cheating that you basically use this as a punishment for. So if you are producing with huge subsidies and or you are devaluing your currency so that no matter how good your domestic competition is, they can never win because you've got a thumb on the scale, then you have what is called a countervailing duty. It's just another word. Duty is a tariff is a duty, and you countervail the cheating value. So those are uses of tariffs against unfair trade practices and disciplining that. Second use is incentives to invest. Tariffs can be used to create or shape a market. And so a lot of people know developing countries use this. We did vis-a-vis Europe when we were a developing country. You figure out a couple sectors that you think are really important for your country to have capacity in. Now, after COVID, we learned some very bad lessons of things we can't make here anymore, that we cannot be so reliant on just one source. I mean, and I'm not just talking about the China sends us way too much stuff, which is true. We were over-reliant on Italy for antibiotics. And when they were hit by that horrible wave of COVID, we had a huge crisis in supplying antibiotics because this hyperglobalization model has led to such concentration in production. We have these single source, super brittle, super thin supply chains. And so we need to pick some things.
Just to interject there, Laurie, our listeners should know that we don't produce antibiotics in this country. 99% of all antibiotics are produced in countries like China and India, where the labs are not adequately inspected by visiting Food and Drug Administration inspectors. So there's an example of what you're pointing out to.
So if we want to incentivize some production back here, we need to set aside some portion of our market for domestic demand. So we're generating a demand, we're generating a market to actually buy the domestic stuff. And so, for instance, at least to get the company started out and to get incentives to invest, you create a market, you create demand. So you would raise tariffs on, name the product. When you use tariffs this way, you pick the sector and you apply it across the board. Typically, you phase them in because you just can't go cold turkey from we don't make it to, oh, we're going to tariff the other stuff. You over time, so that you have the ability to get the investment you're incentivizing to meet that demand. You basically phase in tariffs over time to a higher rate so that by the time 4 years later, you've invested also with the other industrial policy tools to get people to make the capacity. You basically can make some of it here. And you also do that to diversify the import source so that China doesn't become the sole source. There are other tools you can use, but that's an example of using incentives as tariffs in a package of policy tools. The third use is to rebalance trade. And to do that, you basically have to differentiate the countries that are global surplus countries. Those are the countries like China, like Vietnam, where we have countries that have big honking trade surpluses. They sell way more to the whole world than they buy from the world. This is not the bilateral deficit problem. That's a US-Mexico problem. That goes in bucket 1. That is unfair specific things that we can change the rules, we can adjust. That's a bucket 1 thing. Tariffs can come later. We can try and fix the rules, use the penalty later if we don't get it right. Bucket 3 over here is macroeconomic rebalance. We would need to do this most effectively with a lot of the other countries that are in deficit. So right now, there's a handful of countries that have global surpluses. Interestingly, Germany and the Netherlands are in there. That's because they effectively have, like a devalued currency. If they were trading in Deutschmark or Guilder, instead of the bucket that is the euro, which includes the weaker economies, they would be having a balanced trade. But because they have effectively a devalued currency relative to their economic strength they're trading in, they have huge global surpluses with the world and deficits with most of the world. So with that kind of a rebalancing, you basically need with your allies and partners to first try and talk the countries into changing those policies. And then if you don't, you put up barriers to keep out the surplus goods, which, is actually good for the workers in those countries because it forces consumption of their overproduction by their domestic citizens, which is to say, a big part of how you do this is you devalue currencies, you do honking huge subsidies, and you suppress wages. And so in the Chinas, in the Vietnams, part of the wage suppression isn't just mean. It's they don't want consumption in the country. They're exporting it. That is actually their economic model, is to dump it, to beggar thy neighbors and produce it there, dump it elsewhere. So those are three totally legit uses of tariffs. There's some other tools that can do those things, but politically, tariffs may be the most accessible. Now, there are downsides, but one of those downsides, and I hope you ask me this question, it's not that tariffs always raise prices for consumers. Tariffs raise wholesale prices, not consumer prices. If you want to know what the difference is, go ahead and ask.
What's the difference, Lori?
So the difference between whether tariffs raise the consumer price has a lot to do with the same corporate price gouging that we've been seeing over the last couple of years. And we can see right now, for instance, on eggs. The actual supply of egg-laying chickens and the actual supply of eggs is not greatly reduced. Rather, that sector is now so concentrated at every level that the handful of companies can basically control the markup between what the farmer is paid and what the consumer pays. And so what we see, for instance, is just take the example of the Nike shoe that you pay $120 for. And it's based on market research. They know they're going to make the biggest total profit with that margin because they'll get the biggest volume. They make it $130, people will buy less units. So even though they make more per each one, they'll make less overall. But that shoe comes into the US as a wholesale cost to the retailer at maybe $20, $25. And so in that $100 markup, let's just say you put on a 25% tariff. And let's just, to make the math easier, let's make it a $24 shoe. So $6, it's $30 now is the cost at wholesale. But if you raise the price at retail, you're going to sell less shoes. So you just absorb it into the profit margin, which the most sort of careful study of the first round of Trump tariffs showed is mainly what happened with the potential increase in costs. The wholesale cost went up, but it didn't get what's called passed on into the retail price because it was absorbed out of profits. So particularly in markets where there is concentration and there's control in a gap like that, the companies both have the ability to absorb it, but also can price gouge you. So we need accompanying policies like very strong competition policy laws, or for instance, we want protection and therefore more manufacturing capacity to translate into higher wages. We need to make it easier to organize unions. We need to ban stock buybacks in the sectors that get protection so that the gains from protection don't just go into bigger dividends or stock buybacks, but rather turn into higher wages for the workers who will now be having new industrial jobs. So when you use tariffs, you can control for what happens in prices. You can control what happens for wages if you use these accompanying policies. The big problem, and this, Ralph, gets to your question, what is Trump going to do? I'm not holding my breath that Trump or this Republican Congress is strengthening union rights or dealing with price gouging or dealing with basically competition policy for the big corporations that fund them. So I think, though the tools could be highly auspicious, it is going to be pretty risky that translates into the outcomes that actually I think a lot of Democrats would support because, Ralph, when you and I were up on the Hill back then, it was Democrats advocating for balanced trade to help workers, balanced trade to distribute production, balanced trade for peace. And whether or not this crew can do the right use of the tariffs, I am highly skeptical of.
Well, one thing, is it fair to say, Lori Wallach, that the World Trade Organization, the system of governance and tribunal sanctions has collapsed? All the countries now are just doing what they want to do. They're violating the World Trade Organization standards and getting away with it. So what's left of the World Trade Organization in Geneva?
So on that parallel track, separate from the balance of trade and tariffs, on the sort of rules of the global economy, what exists is still those rules are in place. And to some degree, because the enforcement system is not operational anymore, you have the big and powerful countries mainly able to break those rules, but you have the less powerful countries who still are in the stranglehold. And one of the things that we see the Trump administration doing is threatening countries with tariffs. This is a fourth use of tariffs, one that I don't think is actually legit, which is just the bullying use of tariffs for non-trade things, or for things that shouldn't be in a trade agreement, as we argued about WTO, but got slipped in there, like monopoly intellectual property protections. So those kinds of rules, the US goes around and basically says, Trump does, we're going to tariff you if you don't do X, Y, and Z intellectual property rules for our big pharma companies. Or we're going to get you if you don't allow in our banks, or now increasingly our big tech companies. So that, unfortunately, for a lot of the smaller countries, still is hanging over them. And that is why one very big thing that's going to happen this year is the renegotiation of the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. That's Trump's NAFTA 2.0. And that is our chance, sort of the appetizer for the main course being replacing WTO. This is the appetizer. This is our trial run, is to use this USMCA renegotiation. It's a required review. We need to make it a renegotiation with a national push to actually rewrite these rules, chuck out some of the bad corporate rules. And particularly with Trump and these threats, a lot of it just like horrifically cynical. So the Mexico and Canada tariffs are ostensibly about Canada and Mexico being sources of fentanyl, the deadly illegal drug, and undocumented migration. They're using a particular statute for these tariffs because Congress has constitutional authority over tariffs. So if you're going to put in a tariff, you need some authority. It's not something like in the part of the Constitution for the president. So they're using a delegation of authority through a thing called the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, IEPA, and they had to declare an emergency. So fentanyl and migration was the emergency. But here's the thing. When Trump originally did that executive order about that in February 1st, he also closed a thing called the de minimis loophole. That is this lunatic trade loophole that allows in uninspected $800 value of imports to every American every day. And this has been exploited by the huge digital platforms like the Sheins, the Temus, Amazon, to basically skirt paying any of the penalty tariffs, any inspection, any normal customs information. So we don't even know where half the stuff is. This has become a super highway for fentanyl, and tons, but in small packages under the $800 value, of chemicals, the precursor chemicals to make fentanyl, are being drop shipped direct to consumer from China, which makes the stuff that is the precursor chemicals, and is being driven across the border to Mexico to the cartels. And that loophole they closed in the February 1st original order with the China tariff. And then 4 days later, Trump met with the Federal Express CEO, who apparently was not happy because they deliver a bunch of those de minimis packages. Because Ralph, now 4 million de minimis packages come in every day, 80% from China, uninspected, untariffed. So the FedEx guy talks to him in the Oval Office, boom, the next day, they reopen that loophole. So now we have the lunacy of tariffs on China that can be circumvented through a loophole that Trump initially closed and then reopened. So the prospect that even the bullying uses of the tariffs, because, a tariff is not going to stop fentanyl. Can I just make the obvious point as a recovering trade attorney? You do not send your fentanyl in through a customs declaration that goes in and says, hi, I am bringing in fentanyl. Let me explain to you what it is. This is illicit. So it's not as if literally we're sanctioning that particular shipment with a high tariff. What we need to do is close the uninspected package loophole. And instead of doing that, they just basically use tariff as a stick to sort of try and get press on beating up on Mexico and Canada.
There was an effort in Congress a short time ago to do that. What's the likelihood? It seems to be ripe for both Democrat and Republican collaboration here to close that huge gap.
Unfortunately, the express delivery guys, Federal Express, UPS, DHL, and the Xi'ans, Temus, Amazons, have so far been able to get key members of Congress to block the good legislation on this. There have been a couple of bills that really would fix it. That said, I just want to make clear to everyone, this is something that Trump can fix unilaterally without Congress.
So basically, the bully that he is, when he's confronted by corporate bullies, his size or bigger, he backs down.
He basically reversed the ability to stop fentanyl coming from China and to enforce his own China tariffs at the behest of the CEO of Federal Express.
Well, on that point, we're out of time. But before we conclude, Lori Wallach, tell us once more about the website for the American Equilibrities Project and what one or two articles you've written recently that can clarify this whole trade situation under the Trump regime.
So the website I would recommend folks go to is rethinktrade.org. That's rethinktrade.org. It's a subset of the American Economic Liberty Project's website. And then the articles I would recommend, I had a piece in Compact magazine, the conservative magazine, that laid out, and they were very willing to print it, why Trump's tariffs with Mexico and Canada didn't make sense and why closing the de minimis loophole really was going to be the thing that could actually fix the fentanyl problem. And then another thing I would recommend is for folks to follow me on Blue Sky and on Twitter, because what I end up doing, as well as these Instagram videos, I also do sort of rapid response stuff on Twitter and on Blue Sky. And so if you want to sort of know what's happening in real time, that might be one of the best ways to do it. And I am at Wallach Lori. So at WALLACH LORI.
And take this information, listeners, and send it to your senators and representatives, or when they come to get your votes and do the handshaking, give them a piece of your mind. Thank you very much, Lori Wallach.
Thank you, gentlemen. Always a pleasure.